Hello crafty friends, and welcome to today's Stamping September video. Today I'm going to take one stamp set and make 10 different cards using it. This stamp set is a photopolymer stamp set from Clearly Besotted, and it's called Pick a Peony, and I've chosen it for today's video because it's got two different images of peonies, but it's also got a bunch of sentiments as well. You obviously don't need this particular stamp set to do the techniques that I'm going to do today. Use what you have. Doesn't have to be floral. You could adapt these to other image stamps. I've cut myself a pile of smooth white cardstock stitched rectangle panels to work on. This is Winsor & Newton Bristol paper. It's 250 grams per square inch or 114 pound paper. It's not as thick as a card base, but works perfectly fine for a panel, and it's fairly robust. It will take some water without falling apart. Please excuse the crows in the background. They're in the back garden and being particularly noisy today. For my first card, I'm going to do some smooshing and stamping. Firstly, I'm going to take this stamp and stamp it very lightly in the middle of my panel. I'm going to use Pebble Catherine Pooler ink for this, which is a light grey, but before I stamp it I'm just going to take some of that grey off so it's very light, because when I smoosh I don't want to grey the colours that I put on, and that's really just there to give me an indication of where my final stamped image is going to be. I'm going to leave that as it is because I'm going to come back to that later. For my smooshing, I'm going to use scattered straw, saltwater taffy, abandoned coral distress oxides. They're analogous colours near each other on the colour wheel, so they won't make mud when they blend together. I'm going to start with the lightest of the colours, scattered straw, add a bit of water to turn it into a paint, and then take my mini smoosher and gently smoosh it on around my stamped image. I've got some paper towel here which I can use to pick up some of the darker areas, places I don't want there to be darker areas, and I've got a wet paintbrush here that I'm going to use to pick up some of this colour and spatter it on. So this isn't going to be a very clean card, but it's fairly simple. Now I'll give that a blast with my hairdryer to get it nice and dry before I add the next layer. When you wet card and heat it, you can get curling or warping, but that's easily fixed. You can run it through your die cutting machine between two plates just to flatten out, or leave it for a while under a book or other heavy object. Now for some saltwater taffy. And now our strongest colour, abandoned coral. I'm going to concentrate this more towards the middle where the stamped image will be. Just allows for some variation. Another way to uncurl your paper if it curls with heat is to simply heat it on the back side. So when you heat it on the front, it'll warp one way. If you heat it on the back, it'll warp the other way, and you can kind of work at it until it's relatively flat again. So now that's bone dry, I'm brushing talcum powder over it, which is what I'm currently trialling as an anti-static powder for heat embossing. The advantage that the talcum powder has over corn flour or cornstarch is that it smells really, really nice. So as you can see, this is a little bit warped still, but I can use all my magnets to hold it down for stamping. And because this is a photopolymer stamp as opposed to silicone, I'm going to use Memento Tuxedo black ink because this will stick nicely to my stamp. If I'm stamping in black on a silicone stamp, I use Stays On usually. Just press that down and give it a second to transfer. That's come out really well. There's a couple of spots that need a little bit of extra help, I think. Now I'm using sticky ink to ink up my image again, ready for heat embossing. If you use a pigment ink to stamp your image, you probably won't need to use the sticky embossing ink over the top, because pigment inks stay wet for longer, so they will attract the embossing powder without the need for extra embossing ink. So I'm going to dip that in my clear embossing powder and then heat it with my heat tool. So next I'm going to add a sentiment. This one says "with love." I've lined it up where I want it, and I'll stamp and heat emboss it as before. If you want to add a little bit of sparkle to this card, you could take some Wink of Stella pen and paint over the image or part of the image. I've made this shimmer spray from Cosmic Shimmer Pixie Powder White Pearl Mixer. I just added about a teaspoon of the powder to this and filled it with water. I'll just spray a little bit here, pick it up with a paintbrush, and I think I'll just paint this flower here as an example. I might come back later and do the other flower as well. You won't be able to see much while I paint this because it's just very slightly shimmery water. But because I heat embossed the black image, it resists the water and forces all the shimmeriness to stay within the petals. I'll let that dry and then I'll take a close-up in some light to show you the shimmer. So for card number 2, I want to make the sentiment the star of the show, I suppose. I want it to be in the middle of the card, nice and level. So I've got a set square here, and I can push the stamp up against it to make sure that it is straight on my panel. What I'm going to do is heat emboss this in gold, I think. I won't show you that process because it's exactly the same as the process you've already seen me do today. So I'll cut out all the repetitious bits as we move through these other cards. So now I want to add some floral clusters to the corners of my card, just these 2 corners. So I'll start with this one and I'm inking it up with Scattered Straw Distress Oxide. Now I'm going to take some saltwater taffy and add it onto the flower using a sponge dauber because it allows me to be fairly accurate, but it also allows me to fade out the colour so we don't get harsh lines. As you can see, it's starting to change colour. We've got scattered straw underneath the saltwater taffy, but we've got a bit of gradation going on. Take that one off and we'll pop this one on here and do the same process again. And there we have a quick and easy, clean and simple card with some colour and some shimmer and shine. Right, so I have stamped the corner design 3 times because I want to cut out 3 squares using this square frame die. I'm just going to select an area, capturing a flower each. I might actually get away with just using 2 and save that one for something else. I just stamp these in the tuxedo black. I've got some self-adhesive craft foam here and I'm going to cut 3 squares slightly smaller than the die cut by the time I've finished so that I can mount both the frame and the inside bit onto it, and this will just give it a little bit of lift on the front of my card. So I want to colour the flowers. So I'm going to use these alcohol markers. These are Spectrum Noir Tri-Blend alcohol markers. They've got a light, a medium and a dark all built in. So I'm going to colour the whole of this flower with the light, apart from the centre. Going to get it good and saturated. And now I'm going to take the dark and just colour where I think the darkest parts are the shadow parts. This is such a small little image that it's really very straightforward. You can see how kind of haphazard I'm being, and I can go over all of that again with the very light end to blend it all together. And then I can get the lightest end of this, what's this one called? Citrus Blend. That one was called Pale Pink Blend. This one's called Citrus Blend, so a bit of yellow in the middle of the flower. And then I'm going to use Tan Blend, the lightest end again, and just dot some bits on that yellow. Maybe come in with the dark as well, just to give a bit of variation. You know how I feel about my variation. And I might just get that dark in there as well. You obviously don't need to use alcohol markers to colour. You could use colour pencils, watercolours, whatever you like. Just make sure you use the right ink for the job. So I'm not going to film the rest of that for you because that would be very tedious. And I'll come back when I've got everything coloured and show you what the next stage is. So I've coloured in my images. If you're interested in the names, it's Pale Pink Blend, Citrus Blend, Tan Blend, Dull Green Blend, Ice Blue Blend. And I'm thinking of having them situated to the left, very simply, with a sentiment about there, I think. So I've just marked here the centre of my card. I'm going to use my T-square ruler and that mark to get my centre piece down. And now I can stick these down. And there we have another clean and simple card that I don't think needs anything else. So I've die cut a tag out of the same card that I'm using for my card panels, and I'm going to stamp on this in embossing ink and then heat emboss it in white embossing powder. So I don't need to show you that process, but I'm just going to show you this part because I'm using my Altenew stamp wheel just as a stamp positioner because it's got a grip mat in it which allows me to keep my tag still. It's just a little bit easier than using a magnetic stamp positioner, but that's not impossible to do. I do need to treat this with a bit of powder. And I'm using my super clean embossing ink pad because I want to use a, did I say white or clear? One or the other, and I don't want any muckiness from a dirty ink pad showing through. So my white heat embossing has now cooled and set, so I'm doing an emboss resist technique where I'm blending on some colour. This is Tattered Rose Distress Oxide. So I'm blending it over my tag, focusing or intensifying the colour in this bottom left corner and letting it fade out a little bit. And this will add colour to the tag and highlight the embossing. I'm also going to add a little bit of Victorian velvet down this area. So I've smooshed a bit of Victorian velvet there, and I'm going to add some of that shimmery spray that I had earlier. So now I've got some shimmery Victorian velvet to spatter on. So that's dried, and now I'm going to pop a little bit of white embroidery thread through the hole in the tag. And now I'm going to add my sentiment, which says "Hello Friend." I'm going to do that in gold embossing powder up here in the top right corner of the tag. Before I add this to my card panel, I want to give it a little bit of lift. So I've got this 1mm thick foam tape. I'm going to put this on my panel so that the gold sentiment falls roughly in the middle in this direction. And that is card number 4, I believe. If you wanted to add a little bit more to this kind of card, you could put some enamel dots on or some Nouveau drops, something along those lines, maybe some sequins. I think I'm going to leave that as it is. So for card number 5, I'm going to put my stamp over to the right hand side, and I want a band of colour here to stamp on, I think. So that's about halfway, and then that's about, looks like 1.5 centimetres in. So I've drawn a couple of pencil lines, and I'm going to use washi tape to mask off the area that I want to colour. I want to avoid getting ink over here, so I'm just covering this with a bit of post-it or sticky note. And I've got Salvage Patina, Distress Oxide here, and Uncharted Mariner. And I'm going to blend on the Salvage Patina, cover the whole area in that. And then bring in the Uncharted Mariner in a few places. Now I'm going to spray on some of this shimmery spray from up here, so I get a fine mist of shimmery speckles, and I'm going to dry that with my hairdryer. Now for the reveal. So I did manage to tear the paper ever so slightly when I took the washi tape off, but that doesn't matter, we're going to live with that. So put this in my stamping platform. I've flipped it round just because I don't want this stamp too close to the edge. I don't want it getting squashed by the door, the hinge. To stamp this, I'm going for black again because it's going to really stand out nicely on that bluey background. For my sentiment, I'm going to use the words "Hi There" from the stamp set. I'm not going to stamp it directly on the card. I'm going to stamp it on this little bit of scrap and then die cut it out. So I'm just going to add some glue to the back of this. Add it here, about a third of the way down, overlapping the edge of the blended area. And for a bit of dimension and gloss, I'm going to put some Morning Dew Nouveau drops on this blended panel. And that is Clean and Simple card number 5 finished. For card number 6, I'm going to use this spare one from the 3 squares card that I did, and I'm going to fussy cut it out. It's probably going to be fairly straightforward because it's not too detailed. So I've cut that out with my scissors, and I'm just beveling the edges by running this embossing tool all the way around. This will curve the edges over. Please excuse the aeroplane that's flying overhead. It's either crows or pigeons or aeroplanes or lawnmowers or DIY at the moment around here. I much prefer the pigeons and the crows to all the mechanical noises. So my plan is to have this over here on a landscape panel with some bright colour behind it. So leave the die cut, or it's not a die cut, the fussy cut stamped image black and white, but have some colour poking out all around to help it stand out. And then I'm going to use this misuse stamp to add the sentiment, I think about there. So we'll do that in black. Right, that is going to go about there. So just want a couple of little pencil marks to show where it's going to be, and that way I'll know where to put my colour. And I've got some Stormy Sky Distress Oxide here. A nice colour for a miss you card. I'm going to bring that out from here and fade it out just beyond those pencil marks are. And I think I'll add some faded jeans along this end. I've got this stencil which has some unreadable scripty text on it, and I will just go over that so there's a little bit showing around. Let's have a look what that looks like. And now for some splatters. We'll use the faded jeans, a little squirt of shimmer spray. Right, I've added the panel to my card blank, and now I'm going to position this here. It's overhanging slightly, so I'll just snip that off. I rather like the look of the cut off edges. Now I'm going to add some white Nouveau drops. These will very likely absorb some of the colour from the ink that they sit on, so they'll probably tint blue, and that's absolutely fine. And there you have card number 6. Right, on to card number 7. I've actually swapped out one of my panels of Bristol card for a piece of watercolour paper because I want to do some watercolouring. Before I do any stamping or anything though, I want to mask off an area. So I'm just going to hold this still on my grid and then take a bit of washi and place a strip across about 1/3 of the way down, using the grid on my glass mat to help me line it up and get it horizontal. So that will do. But what I'm actually going to do is do a double layer, because sometimes ink can actually seep through washi tape. So I want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So there we go. We've got 2 layers of washi tape there. So I put this fake wall here, this bit of card, to butt my panel up against, because I don't want to squash my stamp with the door. And I'm going to put this on and stamp it in black, then in embossing ink, and then dip it in clear heat embossing powder and then heat it. So I'll come back to you when I've done all that. So I've taken the washi off and I've got an empty band here, which is where I'm going to stamp my sentiment. I don't think I've got that particularly straight, so if I can't tolerate it, I will just do it on another bit of paper and stick it over. So I've decided I want to have a line that runs across the top and bottom of my sentiment area strip thing. So I'm using a black glaze pen, which is slightly shiny and slightly dimensional, so it will work with the heat embossing. I'm just using this bit of paper to act as a straight edge as I run that across. You could use a ruler obviously, but I just grabbed this. I find this pen quite handy as well for fixing any black heat embossing gaps. Once dry, it is waterproof as well, so should still be able to watercolour over it. So I'm going to give this a nice light blue wash of colour, as if it were the sky behind. You obviously don't need to use watercolour for this. You can use whatever media you prefer to colour your images. I will do a video on different ways of colouring images as a Stamping September video. So if you're interested in that, then stick around. Bit of paper towel, dry paper towel, and just blot it a bit so it gets a little bit of texture. And I'm going to do the same on this side, but I'm going to start with some water, just so my blue's got somewhere to go. Give that a dry with my hairdryer. I'm going to make up a little bit of paint here. And I'm going to paint the petals of my peonies using the red. And while those are still wet, I'm going to do a wet and wet technique and just drop in some orange to those petals. No idea if peonies have pink and orange leaves, petals rather, but I have an artistic license and I'm not afraid to use it. And now for some yellow, I'll put that in the middle, and that's okay if that bleeds out. And I can pop in some red, more red where I think there's going to be darker areas. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush because the leaves are quite small, and use some green. If you go over the lines, you can always create a little twizzle with paper towel and use that to pick up, or you can dry your paintbrush off and use it to pick up the colour as well. If you want to add a bit more interest to the leaves, you could always drop in wet and wet some darker splotches. And if you want to add a little bit of something extra, you could always add a few splashes of any of the colours that you've used. I'm just masking off the sentiment area because I don't particularly want splashes on that, so I want to keep that clean. And that is card number 7. I think I can live with a slightly wonky I Pick You. It is a handmade card after all, we're not looking for absolute perfection. So I think that will do. Right, on to card number 8. So for my next card, I'm going to heat emboss again, this time in clear embossing powder. And I'm going to have my flowers just coming in from the right hand side of my panel. I'm going to flip that round, pop that in there, and carefully lay that on so as not to smudge it. So now that's cooled and set, I'm going to blend some shaded lilac distress oxide lightly over this area. So we're doing emboss resist again. I'm just going to work this edge with the ink that's on my brush just to try and fade it out gracefully. Just to add a little bit of a different colour and a bit of extra intensity around this edge, I'm carefully adding a little bit of chipped sapphire. Now I'm going to take a paper towel and just buff over that to get any ink off of the white embossing. And you know what's coming next? Some shimmery splatters. Just going to try and keep most of them over this area here. For my sentiment, I'm going to use the Miss You stamp again because I think it works with this colour scheme. And I'm going to stamp it in chipped sapphire and pop it in this little nook here. Just fits perfectly there. I think I'll give it a second impression. And if you want to keep the card flat, you could leave it as is, but I'm going to add some White Blizzard Nouveau drops. These will dry clear, but they've got a tiny iridescent glitter inside. And that is that card done. For my next card, I have used this stamp, stamped it in embossing ink here, turned it this way, stamped it in embossing ink again, and then heat embossed it in gold. So I've got an identical corner here and here. Now I'm going to add some subtle colouring over my gold heat embossing. This is Spun Sugar Distress Oxide, which is a very, very pale pink. And I'm going to take this tiny stamp here which says XO, one of the little sentiments. I'm just going to add a little bit here and there as a bit of visual texture and interest over the flowers too, so it's kind of in the background behind the flowers. You could do the blending and the stamping before you do the heat embossing. I think that'll do. I don't want to overdo it. Now I'm going to take these two word dies. They say love you, and I'm going to die cut out of this to create an Eclipse card. I'll hold those in place with a sticky note because that shouldn't damage anything, and I've put a bit of scrap card underneath my panel to protect it from the scratches in my cutting plates. Now I'm going to use tape runner and a little bit of glue to attach this to my card blank. I'm just using the glue to go round the hole that the die's cut. Here, where some of the internal parts of the words, the loops and holes and things, need to be inserted, and I'll pop this in here and use that just to poke them through. And now I've got a little bit of smooth white card there. I'm going to pop it on this thin craft foam and die cut these words from it. Now I've got my die cut word of foam and cardstock. I'm going to pop those in the holes. And I'm going to spread a bit of glue. This is just matte gel medium on my glass mat. Dip my final die cuts in and then stick them on top of there. Matte gel medium is pretty good for this because it dries matte, so you won't get any glossy smears, but also it's quite wiggleable. It's not particularly tacky, so it gives you time to wiggle your die cut into place. And to finish this off, I think we'll have a few gold Nouveau drops here and there. Having a few in this space in the middle kind of connects the two sides, and it adds a little bit of movement and energy to the card. And so at first glance you might not be able to see the sentiment, but when you tilt it and look at it from different angles, you'll be able to read the little message there. It's almost a secret hidden message. Right, on to our last card. For my last card, I'm going to do heat embossing again. I've got two identical panels here, and I'm going to stamp this stamp once on each in embossing ink. So for that I used my relatively clean embossing ink pad because I didn't want dark ink showing through this light embossing powder. So I've got a teal shimmery light embossing powder here. This is an embossing powder I made in my Pigment Powders 101 series from some luscious powder and some clear embossing powder. So if you want to know more about that, check that out. So I've done one in teal and I'm going to do the other one in raspberry jam. So these have now heated and cooled. I'm going to buff over them because sometimes with these DIY pigment powders, some of the pigment can stay on the paper, but if you buff them off with a clean dry cloth, you can get rid of that. While I've got my embossing equipment out, I'm going to stamp the sentiment on this piece. This is going to be the front of my card, and I've got the other with love. There were two with loves in the stamp set, one with a scripty font and one with just plain, so I'm going to use that one now. Now that's done, I want to die cut a shape out of this. I've got this stitched rectangle die. I'm going to get it lined up with my T-square ruler, and I want to die cut out these two flowers from this front panel. So now we can remove that and we can keep that for another card. So that's going to sit on top of there like that, and because I stamped them Using my stamp positioner on 2 identical panels, they line up perfectly. But before I stick them together, just going to draw around the inside here and take some of the Raspberry Jam Luscious powder that I've turned into paint, and I'm going to paint on the outside of my embossing. And while that's drying, I'm going to dilute this so it's very pale. Just add a few spatters of the raspberry jam on the front there. If you want to keep this card really clean and simple, omit the splatters. So as per usual, I have accidentally smudged everything. So I'm going to use an excess of splatters to cover it up and make it look purposeful. So as I said, this is going to go on top like this. If you wanted to, you could put some craft foam in between, or you could put a couple of extra layers of card in between. You could even put some acetate over the back of the aperture and turn it into a shaker card. But I'm going to keep it simple because it's not clean, so I want to keep it simple and leave it as it is today. As these bits of paper are quite warped because of all the heating and painting and splattering, etc., I'm going to mount them onto their card blank rather than mount them together and then onto the card blank, because the card blank will help this layer stabilise and flatten out, and then that will help this layer stabilise and flatten out. Now I've just got to align the corner and the side, and they should line up perfectly. And that's that card done. I think if you wanted to add a bit of something extra, you could pop in a few gold Nouveau drops. In fact, I'll do that and you can let me know whether you think it looks better with or without. I mean, there's a lot going on this card. As I say, it's not a clean and simple card. You might even be pushed to describe it as simple, but it's another thing to do with that stamp set. And so there we go, 1 stamp set, 10 quite different cards. I do hope you've enjoyed the video and that it's given you some ideas of things you can do with stamp sets that you already have in your stash. If it has, I hope you join me for the rest of Stamping September. If you'd like to share some pictures of the cards you make this month, then do come to my Facebook group. There is a link in the video description below. Right, thanks for watching. Bye for now.